All right, let's get started for this evening. So, welcome everyone. I have a few people that are in the chat, and hopefully, you'll contribute to today. Today, we are doing chapter 4, pages 61 through 66, in How Not to Read the Bible. Drop my piece of paper there. And this is where we start entering into some of the issues that we find in the Bible. That is, we're going to see some examples of the uh, controversies that we might find in the Bible itself. So, one of the first issues that he raises is I love this little title in it. Um, does the Bible allow you to sell your daughter into slavery? And so I wanted to address that one mainly because I think that is probably a bigger issue for people in our culture than some of the other questions he brought up. The other questions for those of you who have not read the chapter yet is does the Bible say not to play football or eat pork? That is, we can't handle things made out of pigs. Does the Bible prohibit planting two different types of plants together in the same garden and even have the death penalty if you do? And does the Bible prohibit wearing clothes made of two fabrics? Now, the first question is the one about slavery. We're going to talk about that in a second. The one about pork makes more sense now to us because it has to do with dietary food restrictions, and that we will probably deal with those later. But many of those questions are answered in the New Testament with Jesus sort of, it's called abrogating. He says those food laws don't apply because in the new covenant, all things are made clean by God. And so, and the same thing also applies for the planting of seeds, the wearing of clothes. Those rules in the Hebrew Bible, in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, had to do with making Israel distinct culturally. That is, to create a separation between them and the neighboring peoples around them. And that was part of the mission of God to be a light among those other peoples. It's also a way and to create a social separation. And so there's a need when we form social groups in order to have a boundary in which we can know who's part of our group and who's not part of our group. And that's actually going to lead into that first question. Does the Bible allow you to sell your daughter into slavery? Now, I'm going to reference another book that my wife has recently finished reading. My wife is the one who recommended that we do the study on how not to read the Bible. And this book she's read, just finished recently, is Natasha Crane, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, 40 Conversations to Help Them Build a Lasting Faith. And it deals with many of these questions. So I recommend, if you have more questions than how not to read the Bible is going to get into, or if you just need more evidence or more things to think about when discussing these controversial points we find in the Bible, we highly recommend this, Natasha Crane's Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. So she has a question which she deals with this. She has 40 conversations, and so conversation 30 is, does the Bible support slavery? Now I'm just going to read a few of the chapters, a few of the parts here that I thought were very important. And so she starts off with, does the Bible support slavery? There's actually not an easy answer to this question. It completely depends on what a person means by when they say support. Now, I'm not playing word games here. The answer to this question really does require an extended discussion to have any meaningful value for Christians or skeptics alike. So, and then she's going to go on in which there is no passage which explicitly condemns slaveholding, because what the Bible is doing is putting boundaries around the cultural practice of having servants or slaves that we see in the ancient world. She also breaks down that there are several categories of slaves that are specifically identified in Scripture. One of them is what we would call indentured servants, that is, people who work for someone for a set period of time. Uh, you might basically sell yourself into servitude for 7 years, according to the Bible, and you would work for whoever it is you sold yourself to. But at the end of that time, you would be released, right? It isn't chattel slavery that we had in America during the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries. It was indentured servitude, which we also had in America, but we had that back in the 16th and 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, when you had people who would buy a contract to come across into America, and then they would work as a laborer, whatever it is, in the colony, and then they would be set free. This is also how we see other parts of the world were colonized by Europeans as well. Now, so there's a distinction we have to make there between what we call chattel slavery, which is a person is treated as a piece of property and they have a lifetime of slavery. That is, they are never freed. And indentured servitude, in which a person remains a person, they just become basic, they just make a contract with someone and they, you know, dedicate their life to the service of someone for a set period of time. Right. And so the Bible's description of slavery is actually closer to that indentured servitude thing. Now, there is one exception to that, and we're going to get into those, or basically two exceptions of that. So, one exception to that sort of indentured servitude rule is what the question in How Not to Read the Bible gets into. That you would sell your daughter as a slave to become a future wife, right? And so this is part of how we might think of, in our modern terms, arranged marriage. Now, we in America don't really practice arranged marriage in much of our culture. There are still people who do in other parts of the world, and there are people in America who do, but most of us don't practice arranged marriage. And so this is a little bit of a foreign concept to us because it's part of a different culture than what we have. So in this case, these girls are pledged to be married to either the person that's paying the dowry fee, or maybe that person who's paying the dowry fee is getting a future wife for their child, right? Which is the way we see arranged marriage in the cultures that practice it today, right? You have two children at the age of maybe 9 or 10 who are set to be married to each other. The families exchange goods and money. They make an arrangement, and when the children are old enough, then they get married 6 or 7 years later. Right? And that's what we see here. So the reason why these girls didn't go out of slavery, why they were beyond just the indenturement period of 7 years, was because they were being pledged to be married, right? Now, again, it may be weird to us that you're pledging little girls to be married, but you're pledging them to other little boys, right? This is not a case in which our concept of marriage and like Valentine's Day and romance applies to their culture. Again, we talked about that in the last chapter, that the Bible is written for us, not to us. And so it doesn't really always line up with the way our culture is. And so we have to do a little bit of cultural translation to get there. Now, the second exception to the indenture rule is the slaves that come from foreign nations. And those slaves also were for long periods of time. Now, this is probably the closest to what we have as chattel slavery, the idea that people could be held for life and passed down as a possession, as a piece of property. Now, what happens here is why the Bible allowed any of this to happen. First, that's our last section here I'm about to get into. Why does the Bible have this idea of slavery? Well, again, it has to do with, one, Israel living among a peoples that don't practice their religion. Right, so this goes back to that no mixed fields, no mixed clothes, you can't eat pork, you can't do these things. The cultural boundary is supposed to separate Israel, but Israel doesn't fully separate. In fact, when we read the other parts of the Bible, when we read 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, we read even Joshua, when Israel comes into the land of Canaan, they don't separate from the people. They intermarry with these other tribes, they intermarry with these other cultures, and they start practicing these other cultural practices. And so we have to understand that there is a level of accommodation that occurs in the scripture. It's not that God is necessarily saying, go get slaves. It's, since you're going to have slaves, here are the rules by which we're going to do it. These other nations, they're going to practice one kind of slavery. I want you to practice indentured servitude. And these other cultures, they're going to practice arranged marriage in this way. I want you to do arranged marriage like this. These other cultures, they're going to, when they fight other nations and they destroy other villages, they're going to take people as property. I want you to do it in this way. In fact, one of the more interesting parts about that is going back to that last group, the group that's probably the closest to child slavery, which is the foreign-born slave, implies that you got them by defeating another nation. And yet God never tells Israel to go fight other nations just to go get slaves. He tells them to fight these tribes so that they can conquer the land, but they were in fact not supposed to take slaves in those conquests. And then after they've taken the land in the time of David and Solomon, when they have their own kingdom, we never see God telling them to go into these other nations and burn down their villages and take these people as slaves. So the rule may never have been applied. It may have just been put on the books so that we know what the rule would have been. If this happens, this is how you're supposed to treat people. Right? So again, we have to separate what we think is proper and ethical to do from what the Bible is trying to describe and accommodate with it. Now, I'm not saying this is an easy conversation, and you may not be pleased with the way that I've interpreted how the rules make. And so, again, I refer you to this resource, the Natasha Crane book. I ask you to look deeper into it. This is a hard issue when we talk about taking the Bible and translating it into our culture. When we translate the Bible into our culture, we often have to say, these are weird things that we don't do anymore. These are practices that don't apply to us anymore because they are from 3,000 years ago, from a different continent and a different cultural moment than we live in. And that's not always the best answer. That doesn't make us all have warm, fuzzy, tingly feelings because it just solves all the problems for us. But the Bible has other issues that I think are more controversial, right? And so when, again, if you are getting sort of stuck on this, or if people you're talking to are getting stuck on this point, then push through. Admit that it is a difficult part of the scripture to understand. And it's definitely not a part of the scripture that we can apply. But just like other parts of the scripture, they were written for a certain moment and they do still have a lesson for us. And this is sort of where I'm going to kind of tie it up with a bow. The lesson of these rules is sort of twofold. First of all, we need to understand whether these rules, like eating certain types of food or not eating types of food, wearing certain types of clothing, having certain types of practices, having certain types of planting or commerce or ownership structures, sometimes the lesson there is we are supposed to be distinctive. We are not supposed to blend in with the culture or cultures around us, but we're supposed to not necessarily stand out, but stand apart from what the world of sin is looking like. And sometimes the interactions we have to live in, we still have to live in this world, in this body. We still have to go to the grocery store and get eggs and milk. And sometimes we have to accommodate as we live in a culture, but not necessarily connected to that culture. We can live, the phrase that I grew up in learning was, you live in the world, not of the world. And the second aspect of this is sometimes we need to look behind the rule and see what the ethical choice is. How are we supposed to treat people? We're supposed to treat people as people, not property. That's the problem we had in America in the 18th and 19th century, is that we forgot that we were supposed to treat people like people. And we got into our heads that certain people were subordinate to us or inferior to us, or they weren't even human anymore. And that is not what God is teaching in his scripture. He's teaching us that all of us are human and all of us come from the same source. We all come from Adam and Eve and from Noah and from these, all of our nations, despite what our speech is like, what our skin color is like, what our cultural practices are like. We are supposed to respect each other, love each other, and draw each other back into relationship with God and with each other. Now, one more thing I want to say in the chapter was that there is a lot of rituals that we're going to get into as well. Um, and so there's a lot of practices that, again, don't apply. Perhaps one of these days we can go and step by step through Exodus and Leviticus together. And maybe in a future series I'll do that. And when we do, we'll start talking about all these weird rules. And sometimes we just confront the rule and go, that's weird. I don't know if that's a good answer for you. I don't know if you like that answer or not, but that's my answer. All right, let me see if there's anything up in the chat. All right, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'll give a few minutes just in case there's someone else going to jump on. While I'm waiting for the chat, we'll talk about our next chapter. So for next week, we're going to do chapter 5, The Art of Not Cherry Picking Bible Verses, and that's going to be pages 67 through, this is a good long one, 67 through 80. So chapter 5, pages 67 through 80. And we again are going to come back and deal with the issues of some of these verses and how to deal with them, how to deal with the weirdness of the verses that we see. Okay? And so let me check it one more time. All right. Well, thank you for being here. If you're just here in the recording, that's great too. Thank you for being here for our session. And I hope that you confront the weirdness of the Bible and come with questions, and that those questions don't drive you away from God, but they draw you to God. And with that, I'm going to say good evening.